So, good morning. Glad to be here with you all, and thank you to Diana and the committee for the invitation to come chat with you today. So, I feel like I should make a disclaimer right up front and tell you I am not a scientist. I am a librarian, and shameless plug, the librarians can be your best friend in the work that you do. We have lots of great science librarians, applied health sciences librarians, even your public librarian can help in the work that you do and help us eliminate some of this fake news. So I just want to get started with a few concepts. So as you heard in the introduction, some of the work that I do is related to information behavior. And I usually, in a nutshell, say that information behavior is how people use, seek, and avoid information. And as part of that, we talk about how people interact and are essentially susceptible to fake news. And one of the reasons that people are susceptible to fake news is because of emotions. We are humans, we are complicated beings, and we encounter and interpret and use information in very different ways. And so, there is a dimension of perhaps intellectual laziness involved, but there are so many dimensions and so many reasons that people are susceptible to fake news. And so again, one of them is emotions, and that's what we'll talk a little bit about today. So it is said that we now live in an era of post-truth. All right, and so just as a kind of to back up just a second, fake news is not new. There are accounts of the phrase fake news being used as early as the 1890s and in print newspapers and media. And actually, post-truth is not new. Stephen Colbert talked to us almost over a decade ago about truthiness. And truthiness and post-truth, we'll use them interchangeably, really talking about this idea that we are believing information based on our guts. We are believing and accepting and using information, sharing information based on our hearts, based on our beliefs, not because that we actually think it's factually true. And so what becomes especially tricky about fake news is that intellectually, cognitively, I can know that that article is garbage, but maybe I like the author. Maybe I like that particular source. Maybe someone that I trust forwarded it to me, and therefore I'm going to go with my gut and say, oh, well, Kate wouldn't send me garbage, right? So I'm going to believe this article. All right, so this is this idea of post-truth. We are leading with our guts, and we're not taking the time to go back into our critical thinking, what a lot of us are trained in about, how to critically evaluate and use information. We're not going back to our default. All right, and as you heard in the previous presentation, this is particularly heightened with our political climate and things of that nature. So as a librarian, I've been working in what we call information literacy for 20 years. And information literacy is really just teaching people how to critically evaluate and use information. After the last presidential election, I started getting phone calls and emails. Oh my God, fake news, this crisis, what are we going to do? And my reaction was like, what are you talking about? With this idea that we've always had fake news, we just called it something different. Okay. So when we talk about fake news and we want to bring it into larger context, fake news is essentially a form of misinformation. And so very simply put, misinformation is information that is false. It's misleading, but it may not be purposely designed to be false or misleading. So if you remember the game that we played as kids as telephone, right? And if I tell someone something in this part of the auditorium, and then they whisper it across the auditorium, by the time it gets to the other side, the message could be completely misconstrued. It can be completely different. Now, that doesn't mean that there was any ill intent. It just means that people are people. We hear things the way we want to hear them. And by the time we pass that information on, it could be false. So when we're talking about information that we're sharing, particularly online, I think maybe all could admit to sharing information that we have not read or that we have not clicked on the link to actually read the article. All right, so the speed with which information is shared, and this is why misinformation, disinformation, which I'll talk about in just a second, and fake news become really so problematic, right? Because they're moving with such speed, it's hard to get things back. And at this point, we're just inundated with information and fake news. All right, so misinformation, information that is false. Now, its sibling is disinformation. Disinformation is information that is also false, but is also purposely created to be false. It is purposely created to mislead and to actually harm. Okay, so this is what you're hearing about this morning. This is what you'll hear about in some other sessions. There are people whose job it is to create clickbait and false information, disinformation. All right, so it's part of what we call political economy. This idea that this is for profit. So there are a lot of folks, as much work as we do to combat misinformation, disinformation, fake news, there are people that actually work in cubicle farms whose job it is to pump out fake information because they want you to view their website. Okay, so that would be disinformation, information that is purposely created to mislead or harm. There is a third category called malinformation, M-A-L, and that is also disinformation, false information that is purposely created to harm or mislead. But when you think of things like revenge porn or doxing or things that are really, really harmful and could actually be criminal, so then we come into an even darker third category of malinformation. And fake news also falls into that category. Lots of different reasons, in addition to the emotional dimension about why people are susceptible to fake news. One of them is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is this idea that you will seek and use information that already confirms what you know. Right? So if you tend to look at particular sources because you like those particular authors, or it has a particular political leaning or other leaning that you subscribe to, you might be more inclined to just use that source because it confirms what you already know. All right, so you see this a lot in partisan politics and other types of news sources. This could also be discussed as a filter bubble. All right, if you're on social media, whatever platform that you're using, you could go all day, you could go a week and not see any information that contradicts what you know or believe, right? We are able to so carefully curate our feeds, our friends, what we see and what we interact with. It is very possible to really just give in to confirmation bias and or filter bubbles. Another problem that we have is information overload. And this is not exclusive to fake news or misinformation or disinformation. Information overload we have every day of our lives. So as we go through our day and you decide what you're going to wear, what you're going to eat, how you're going to drive to campus, there are so many pieces of information that we just absorb and don't even really think about or we're not even cognizant of how we're interacting with that information. Some information we choose to use, right? If you see that there's a detour or something, you might actively use that information to reroute. There's other information that we absorb and just immediately dismiss, right? We all have our mental frameworks for how we use and avoid information. So when we have information overload and we have fake news and misinformation and disinformation coming at us from print sources, from radio, if you're still listening to radio, podcasts, the internet, we have information coming at us from every angle at all points of the day. All right, and so this can contribute to this idea of, I'm just so overwhelmed, I'm just gonna pick the first website that comes up. Or I'm just gonna listen to this one story and I'm gonna get all my news for the week because I'm just so overwhelmed, I can't take it, and I'm just gonna pick something that's easy, something that I can subscribe to and that will let me know what I need to know. So different responses to information overload. But if we're not careful about the information overload and really critically thinking about what we're absorbing, we can be more susceptible to fake news, misinformation, and disinformation. Another dimension is cognitive authority. And cognitive authority is essentially, who do I believe? Right? And so your cognitive authority you can assign to other people, you can assign to other organizations, you can assign it and revoke it at will, right? This is really how you think about information and how you decide who you're going to trust for the information that you use. All right, so as an example, my mother is a registered nurse, right? So I give her all of my cognitive authority when I have a health question. You know, how do I know if I have a cold? What should I take? That kind of thing. Now, you know, she's not a particularly good gardener, right? So she might not be my cognitive authority for gardening, right? I may have someone else that I ask, you know, it's planting season, what should I put in the garden, right? Maybe I have one cognitive authority for flowers and I have a different cognitive authority for perennials, right? So cognitive authority is very layered, it's nuanced, we don't always think about it, but it is. Now, in terms of revoking that cognitive authority, if I go to a friend's house that is my cognitive authority in gardening and I see that yard is a mess, I may revoke cognitive authority. All right, so particularly for those who provide information and communicate with others, these are some of the things that we need to think about when we're providing information to others, right? Your information can be spot on, it could be perfectly researched, but if someone doesn't give you cognitive authority, or if they're overwhelmed, or if they're just cranky that day, they may not be receptive to what you're putting out, right? And so there isn't necessarily a rhyme or reason to it, and there really isn't necessarily anything you can do about it. It's just context that you need to have when you're preparing information to give out to other folks. And part of this trust is very much related to this cognitive authority. Who do I trust? And how do people come to decide what sources they trust for their news information, their science information, any other information that they are consuming? You'll always hear people say, I don't watch that channel, or I only watch this channel. I don't listen to that person. You know, I don't read this particular paper. People have very clear ideas about what sources they trust and mistrust. Now, depending on, you know, how much a person is really thinking about it, how much they discuss it, they might actually be able to tell you, this is why I trust this person, or this is why I don't trust that person. But perhaps the average person, if you ask them, why don't you watch this channel? You may get something like, I don't like that person, or I don't like what they're saying. But they might not have a really nuanced explanation for why they trust and not mistrust. So again, going back to the beginning with post-truth, they trust because their gut tells them to trust, or they distrust because their gut says, yeah, I don't like that, okay? So let me show you two things. Just give you a second. All right, are we seeing the distinction between the two? All right, so this is essentially post-truth, right? This is us looking and evaluating information with our gut. So I'll see it. You can show me all the evidence you want. You can show me all the data you want. But if I don't trust you, or if I don't subscribe to what you're saying, or if there's any type of discrepancy here, I'm just not going to believe it. I could see it, but I'm just not going to believe it. All right, so let me give you a couple of examples. And so the examples are really, you know, going along with this idea that we have emotional reactions to information. All right, so you as a science writer, as a communicator, you could give me a story this morning, and if I'm in a good mood and the coffee was good outside and, you know, I saw a couple people that I know, I'm all for your article. All right, and yes, this is excellent. I'm going to, share it with my students, et cetera. Now, if you catch me at 5 o'clock and I'm sleepy and there's traffic and I don't know what I'm cooking for dinner, or I just got a text from someone that had bad news, you could give me the same article or tell me the same information and I will receive it completely differently, right? Because of my own emotional state. All right. So again, this is information and context that we need to be aware of with our readers, and also, for ourselves. How are we interpreting information when we are trying to then write about it, or then research about it, or then provide it to other people? All right. So a couple of examples. On the left-hand side, this particular example, I don't know if you can see it, but at the very top in really, really tiny writing, it says that this is an advertisement. Okay, but what you see is that very large headline, "New pill reverses memory loss in an amazing way." And so you see this in newspapers, you see this in magazines, you certainly see it online. And you'll see a lot of literature that says, fake news, seniors and older adults are most susceptible to fake news, which is not necessarily true. But this is the type of information that is purposely targeted at seniors, right? So they're particularly susceptible to health information because they may have some other health issues. They're always looking for new information to see if they can find a cure or a solution or something. And so really what they're trying to do at the end of this article is to sell a particular product. And so again, you're looking at that headline, you may not see advertisement. It's very similar to when you go to Google and you do a search, and like the first 5 hits or so are usually sponsored ads, right? So sometimes we're not always paying attention to that. So this is an older print example of that, if you will. The other thing that I don't think you can see in this article is that under the little abstract, there is an author's name, Daniel Ward Sr., and his byline is listed as the Associated Health Press. There is no such thing as the Associated Health Press. So what it's relying on is your recognition of the Associated Press, right? So we know that that's a source. We're familiar with that source. We know that they put out short stories and they're syndicated and things of that nature. So when we're doing the critical evaluation, the people who are coming up with this type of information, they know that you rely on visual cues and oral cues and cues that are related to things that you may already know and trust. On the right-hand side, very provocative title. All right, and so that is one of the cues. If you see a title that is in all caps, or if you see a title that is excessively flowery or absolute, that could be, a cue that, something is amiss here. And so what these examples are giving you are fake experts. All right, so on the right-hand side, this was an article that came out in 2017 that claimed that this data was brand new and revolutionary. And it was actually based on an academic article from 2010 that said nothing of the sort. So in this brand new, groundbreaking article, women absorb and retain DNA from every man they have sex with. In actuality, what they were saying is that in autopsy results, women had male chromosomes in their bloodstream. Now, that could have happened because they had a male child, they had a male sibling, particularly a twin, or they could have had a blood transfusion, right? So we have this thing where it's based on science, it's based on, hopefully, an article that's not been retracted, and it's spun years later into something that's salacious and will hopefully get a click or a purchase or something of that nature. All right, so when we have articles like this, and particularly if they can reference what sounds like an academic journal, right, that's one of those cues that people have to say, oh, well, it cites an academic journal. And we know there's no bad academic journal, there's no bad academic article. right? So people are relying again on, I'll get by on association, even though that association is manufactured. Okay. Misinformation and misinformation and disinformation, particularly as it comes to health and scientific information. So this is Ethan Lindenberger, and he is a high school senior from Connecticut, and he made some news last fall because he testified in front of the Senate after he made headlines for getting vaccines at the age of 18. And so he explicitly went against his parents' beliefs and wishes. His parents did not believe in vaccines, and he and his siblings were not vaccinated. And so he came to do his own research, and he decided that he was at risk and he was going to go ahead and get vaccinated. And because he was 18, he was able to do that. And so in his explanations, he talked a lot about, if you follow the story, you can see that he polished it up a little bit. But in the beginning, he said, he actually said his parents were stupid for, believing this. But he evolved after he hurt his mother's feelings. But really said that she was susceptible to a lot of conspiracy theories, fake news, misinformation, and disinformation. And he explicitly blamed Facebook. All right, who doesn't blame Facebook? But you have a lot of groups, and you have the news and the articles and things that are spreading so quickly. His mother believed that the vaccines would cause autism and other health problems, and she decided not to vaccinate her children. So in a subsequent interview, she did admit, reluctantly, that she read all of the research that he had compiled, and she actually saw the benefit in what he was saying. She still wasn't going to vaccinate her younger children. All right, again, she saw all the evidence and she could admit that she believed it, but she still wasn't going to change her mind about what was best for her children. Okay, and certainly that is her prerogative. Now, there was a story on the news that I saw this morning as I was coming, so I couldn't update my slide for you. We all know that there's a current measles outbreak in different parts of the country. And in New York, the epicenter is in Rockland County, New York, which has a predominantly Orthodox Jewish population. And so this report was fascinating. I actually sat there with my jaw dropped open. They displayed a pamphlet, a paper pamphlet that has for years been passed around this particular community. And the Orthodox Jewish parents are not vaccinating their children. This is currently the epicenter for the measles outbreak in New York and that region. And when they're asking people, why are you not vaccinating your children? And the parents are citing this pamphlet. And the investigators, were looking at this pamphlet. They were calling the phone numbers that were associated, for contact information, because that is one of the things that we're taught to look for. When we're looking at a piece of information, does it have a source? Is there someone we can contact? Is there something we can look at, further? And so they did all of that. The addresses went to vacant warehouses, because they actually went to the address on the pamphlet. The phone numbers went to recordings, untraceable recordings, and the recordings said that all vaccines cause encephalitis and autism, and that you shouldn't vaccinate your children. So there was no actual live person to talk to and try and confirm or deny this information in the pamphlet. And what they also found was that the Jewish population, when they would go to synagogue, there were perfectly timed texts coming to these folks saying, don't vaccinate your children and please call this number. And the number would link back to one of those recordings. So when we're dealing with misinformation and disinformation, the folks producing this are very organized and they're very strategic, right? So, when I do the work that I do in the School of Information Sciences, we talk a lot about being strategic and being proactive in evaluating this information because the producers are outpacing us in that regard. Okay, So celebrity culture. And this is Jenny McCarthy, an actress who, for a lot of people who also believe that vaccinations are harmful, will cite Jenny McCarthy. Now, I don't know why anybody would cite Jenny McCarthy for particularly health information, but we can attribute some of this to celebrity culture, right? I mean, for decades, celebrities have been pitching us products. Infomercials, commercials, product placements, all of these things. And so this is just the latest example of this. And so she has a son. Her son might be a teenager at this point. And she felt that his autism was caused because of his vaccines. And so for several years, she had a lot of press. She did a lot of interviews saying, don't vaccinate your children. I regret vaccinating my son. Now, at some point, she did actually retract that. But as you heard in some of the previous sessions, by the time those retractions come out, we have moved so far past this, you probably don't even know that she retracted it. And if you were to look her up and look up Jenny McCarthy and autism, you're going to see her previous claims. Okay? And as a side note, since we're talking about media and communication, this kind of thing, when we're writing things up and when we're presenting information to other people, we could write a neutral story, one that is fact-based and well-researched. But if you put a picture up like this, that could demonstrate a little bias, right? So when I was looking for pictures of her, this was an article that was trashing her about a movie, not necessarily about her political views. There are lots of other pictures of her where she has her glasses on and her hair pulled back and she, looks a little bit more astute than she does in this particular picture, right? So this idea of how we are acquiring information, it is not just from print, it is also from pictures, right? It's also from other information that could accompany the stories that you're writing. Another example of celebrity culture. Does anyone know who this is? Okay, thank you. Yes, so this is Selma Blair, another actress, perhaps not as well known. Movie actress, 90s, 2000-ish, teen movies, types of things. At this year's Golden Globes, she arrived at a party in this very spectacular dress and, in a very posed picture. And the headline was, Selma Blair reveals that she has MS, multiple sclerosis. All right? And so the picture, you can see at the side, she has a walking stick or a cane. All right? And so she was using this opportunity and has done subsequently several interviews detailing her health and how she feels like it was going to impact her career, et cetera, et cetera. So in this particular instance, it appears at this moment that she is using her celebrity to promote good information as opposed to misinformation and disinformation. All right, so different examples of the celebrity culture. Now, what wound up happening is that she acquired a whole new fan base. So, there's some strategic celebrity things happening here. I won't watch her movies still, but I might check her out on Instagram to see how she's doing. All right, so she is bringing awareness to a very serious medical issue. So you had one example of celebrity culture run amok. You have another example of it at this point being used to benefit others. So I have a couple more examples for you about misinformation, disinformation, specifically as it relates to health and wellness and science. But if we're talking about larger context, unfortunately, we can never get away from other issues like race and ethics and things of that nature. There's lots of discussions in my particular profession about, libraries are neutral and information is neutral. There really is no neutral information. All right, so when we're making our decisions about the information that we consume and share, we do need to be keeping ethics, race, and lots of other issues in mind. So this is Caster Semenya, who is a South African runner, perhaps one of the fastest women that we've ever seen in the sport. Caster Semenya has been in the news of late because essentially the authorities in the sporting world have said she's too fast and she's threatening the men and she's winning over the men. And because, you know, when we're talking about sports, only the men, and usually only the white men, can be the fastest and win the most awards. So Caster Semenya has a hormone imbalance, which I can assure you the women in this room can tell you is not uncommon. So she has a higher level of testosterone, which makes her a little bit faster. So the authorities have said to her, if you want to continue to compete, you must take a drug that will lower your testosterone because you have an unfair advantage over the other women that you're competing against. But they told her she could run with the men. So she lost her appeal. It remains to be seen if she will continue. She said she will not take the drugs. I can't say that I blame her for that. But what I wanted to get to is that this is a screenshot from Fox News. And this was the headline that they ran. Transgender runner loses court appeal. Caster Semenya is not transgender. She has high levels of testosterone. So this is what we call dog whistling. It really is just racism, but it's dog whistling, right? So you're putting out a concept or a term that you know is going to incite or inflame or upset. All right, and so when you click on the article, they're talking and they're actually lying about this runner. And then further down, they link to another story where they were talking about a trans wrestler. And that story was equally egregious. And then the article devolves into, you know, this is a moral issue. And it really does turn homophobic and transphobic. All right, so this was meant to kind of incite, all right, even if it was then talking about some of the actual medical or scientific issues, it was meant to essentially inflame, and then it moves people away from the issues. Okay. Two more examples for you. On the left-hand side, the headline, Black moms are dying at higher rates. Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren call for change. So the reason I wanted to give this particular example, Black moms are dying at higher rates. What I found interesting about this was how many non-Black people that I spoke to after these rallies and people, you know, Kamala and Elizabeth were talking about it and said, did you hear that Black mothers have a higher mortality rate? And this was brand new information for a lot of people, when in fact this has been happening for I don't know how many decades, okay? So when you're hearing this idea of amplifying the signal, why aren't we hearing more about this? We heard from Serena Williams, all right? Famous Serena Williams, arguably one of the greatest tennis players, if not the greatest tennis player of our time, and has an enormous amount of money. She came out and said that she almost died after childbirth because of complications and because of her doctors and providers not believing that there was something wrong, right? So if you're thinking about various types of privilege, and this woman has as much money as she needs, and she still can't get the care that she requires. And so there's literature that says the medical community thinks that Black people and other minorities don't feel pain, or that they don't feel pain as much as others. So they're reluctant to provide drugs and treatment because they think that the women are being dramatic, or that they're not really, they just want drugs, okay? So to say, these are examples of stories and issues that deserve amplification. All right, in 2019, it was amazing to me that someone would say, I had no idea about this, okay? Now, on the right-hand side, this was just bizarre to me, but it happened. All right, so this is Abby. Abby is a sea otter at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Abby's a little chunky. We don't pick on Abby. Abby is happy. That's all I care about. So the aquarium put this out on social media, and by all accounts, they were probably attempting to be funny. A lot of people did not find the captioning funny. What is happening here in this caption is a use of African American vernacular English. All right, and some thought that the captioning was insensitive and that it was culturally appropriating Black English, and they took offense to it. And so there is a lot of tweeting happening at the aquarium saying, really? Right, there was no better way for you to talk about Abby than to call her thick and you know, all of these things. And so what wound up happening, amongst other things, is there was an article written up in the Sacramento Bee, and the article, and I use that word loosely, was really just a compilation of tweets. And the author wound up taking tweets from an African-American woman, a scientist, a well-known, regarded scientist, who was particularly critical. The writer took her tweets and then became critical of her. So it no longer became about Abby. And so this woman, this African-American scientist, was trolled and threatened and doxxed and all of these things. And so this is, you know, an example of where ethics come in. All right, so on different levels. Her tweets were used without permission. She was not contacted for comment. She didn't even know what was happening until she started getting all of the mentions. All right, and this writer wound up putting her at risk. And for what? All right, so, and I should also mention that there were lots of other scientists of all races, creeds, et cetera, who were complaining about this post. Their tweets weren't used. You know, they were not put in harm's way. All right, so, you know, ethical concerns about how we are using information, and then, you know, how this then becomes misinformation and disinformation when we cherry pick facts or cherry pick different details and target certain people to say, oh, well, look, you know, this Black woman has a complaint, and this Black woman hates Abby the sea otter, right? Which is nothing about what she said. All right, so these two examples are really good examples of stereotype threat. All right, and so we all have implicit biases, we all have stereotypes, and you know, the stereotype threat that this represents is that what I mentioned earlier is that Black women don't feel pain. That is a stereotype threat in terms of how the medical community may interact with this population. Stereotype threat saying that, you know, Abby is ghetto because they're using African American vernacular English. All right, so different things to think about, not only when you're reading information in headlines, but when you're producing them as well. So I just want to end again with this idea of strategic amplification versus strategic silence, right? So that becomes particularly important when we're talking about misinformation and disinformation, because you all have a lot of power if you're putting out your stories and your pieces that are received by an audience. So strategic amplification, are there worthwhile stories and people that you can highlight? And are there people and stories that you should probably not give any more attention to? All right, so unfortunately, you know, we have a lot of mass shootings, and what we've been seeing lately is reporters saying, I refuse to name the person that shot these people today, right? That is an example of strategic silence. Instead, I'm going to name the people who lost their lives or who were injured, or the people who demonstrated heroism and really tried to assist. That is strategic amplification. All right, so, you know, it becomes difficult because, you know, there is a monetary bottom line. You know, we talked about political economy, and you have to sell papers or you have to get subscribers, and there's always some type of number that underlies, you know, the industry, you know, that we're in. But is there more responsibility that we can take? are there more ethics that we can consider when we do the work we do, so we don't contribute to the consistent problem of fake news, misinformation, and disinformation? I am hoping that the phrase fake news will go away shortly, but the actual phenomenon will never go away. We'll just call it something else. All right, but there are ways in the work that we do that we can hopefully work against it and combat it. So thank you so much for your time, and I think we have a few minutes for questions. Yeah, so if I want fake news to go away, what do I want to use? I really just want to use misinformation and disinformation. I think part of the problem that we have is that fake news has essentially been co-opted, and it's used to just rebuke and say, I don't like that, so I don't want you to pay attention to it. Fake news, and it loses its actual meaning. So I think misinformation and disinformation better encompasses the actual phenomenon.
For those of us in writing roles, communication roles, a lot of times you want to just stick within what you're covering because you want to have that stuff that you were talking about. Like, this is the brand that you can trust us for, this is the kind of stuff you come to us for. But when we come across situations where, I know you mentioned it earlier, where you say, why are we hearing more about this? Sometimes that's a result of people selectively sectioning out into their own little information ecosystems. I guess, what are your thoughts on balancing us trying to get into those outside ecosystems to share those kinds of facts versus staying true to the kinds of information that we are trying to be known for? I'm sorry if that didn't make it.
No, it does, but it's a hard question. So if you didn't hear the question, it's essentially about how do you balance the information that you're known for or that perhaps you're charged with covering versus other stories that you think might deserve amplification or coverage. Does that?
Kind of, yeah. Or when people come at you with the attitudes of why aren't they hearing more about this? How much commentary or how much time and effort do you want to spend on commenting on that kind of thing?
Okay. Yeah.
Information versus just going back to.
So how do you redirect them?
Right.
Yeah. So I think maybe the easiest way, and easiest, at least in my mind, is can you refer them to a source that you trust that might be covering that particular issue, right? Because I agree with you, not one person or entity or source can do all of the things, right? But maybe there's another source, or maybe there's another organization or another person who could shed some expert commentary on that topic, right? And then that becomes perhaps another way to generate trust, because you're telling the person that hopefully trusts you, well, this is a source and a person that I trust that might have some more information, that's to suit your particular question. I saw a series of tweets yesterday, and I didn't get a chance to, dig deep into it. There was something on NPR that folks disagreed with, and folks actually tagged Code Switch, which is one of NPR's podcasts, and said, are you going to let this stand? And the Code Switch people got a little cranky. And I understood why they were being cranky. They said, so you want us to essentially go to our colleagues in another building who are on another beat and who have a completely different editorial, responsibility, and you want us to go correct that information. And so it got a little heated in the exchange. And the original poster said, no, I don't want you to correct it. I want you to talk about it. And I want you to talk about why this was particularly false, or, how to go about it. So that reminded me of your question, because I think that puts them in a difficult position because they literally knew nothing about it, right? But now someone else is coming to them saying, well, you're NPR too. And it's like, but you don't understand the branches of the organization. So again, lots of layers. I agree with what you're saying. And so I think what Code Switch could have done was say, this is not really our area, but maybe it's somebody else's area to address, the concerns that you have about the particular piece.
How easy is it to draw the line? Do you have guidelines to draw the line between, making sure information products are reliable and, concepts like censorship or infringing on, people's rights to speech?
Another shameless plug for your librarian, because this is literally what we talk about all the time. There is that fine line between, hate speech, free speech, et cetera, but it is also that idea that free speech doesn't mean that you're free from consequences. You'll go in a library and find information that you despise, right? But because it may appeal to someone else, we keep it there, right? So we're about information access, things of that nature. Not saying that information is neutral, but saying that you don't have the right to steal the book or tell us we can't have the book if someone else could use it, right? So there is that fine line, and I think that's where the trust and the communication comes in between the information provider and the information consumer. So I'm giving you a very, top level, but to say that we do talk about this all of the time. But, and that would also go to that line between misinformation and disinformation, right? So misinformation, it could just be as easy as I didn't hear you. And then I repeated what you said, and that's not really what you said. But the disinformation, and this is where we get into different intentions, which are sometimes hard to discern. If this person is purposely trying to trip you up or to harm you, then I think that's the area where we need to say, is there something that we can do about this? Now, someone else asked me about, at another talk, should the government get involved? And at this point, I don't want the government to get involved in anything. Because I think it's a slippery slope about what could be regulated and what couldn't be, right? And this is when, sometimes people will say, oh, well, I created this browser app that will identify fake news. That's cool, but I think we still have to primarily be manually interacting with the information that concerns us. So again, it's a tricky question about how do you kind of decipher that, but I think it's going to be that trust and discussion and really kind of getting into the evaluation as opposed to kind of that post-truth, knee-jerk, looking at headlines, oh, I'm going to share that, oh, I'm going to click on that, oh, I don't like that, and you don't really have all of the context. Yes?
Nicole, thanks for that talk, that was great. I just wanted to get your take on navigating a tension between two different principles as a journalist. So one is appreciating that, as you say, there is a certain ethical responsibility in quoting people's tweets, in that women, people of colour, and especially women of colour, are more likely to experience harassment, doxing, all the rest when you're quoting them in the context of topics that may be controversial. But equally, I think as a journalist, we all feel that things that are written on social media are in the public domain. And to take a very extreme example, I would not be reaching out to Donald Trump for permission to discuss Donald Trump's tweets. So what are your thoughts on how to deal with that tension between on the one hand wanting to recognise that some sources are disproportionately vulnerable, but also that there are these sort of universal guidelines about what is and is not in the public domain.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. My first thought to that is that Trump is a known figure, a public figure. He wants you to, engage with his tweets and things of that nature. I think there's a difference between Trump and, faculty members here at the U of I, or anywhere, really, So we have these discussions about whether or not we are public intellectuals. Now, I have had people tell me that I am a public intellectual. I actually push back on that. And as a consequence, I have locked down all of my social media because I have been trolled and doxxed and all of these things. So I think there's a balance, right? So if you have public intellectuals who are writing op-ed pieces or who are writing in mainstream media as opposed to the peer-reviewed journals, those are the folks that are more on the public intellectual side. Now, with that said, for something like the Abby incident, I think a more even representation of the tweets may have derailed all of the problems that the woman encountered, right? And then, you know, if this reporter was adamant about just focusing on her, he could have tweeted her, right? Maybe she didn't answer, maybe he didn't, or you know, what have you. But I think there was some due diligence that was completely lost. And it really came out as a hit piece because it was just her comments, right? So with this particular example, there were hundreds of tweets. He could have picked one from her, he could have picked one from this wide array, but to focus on her, I think that's where perhaps he crossed that particular line and made her more vulnerable than she already was. But I appreciate what you're saying and agree with you about, you know, what's out there as public. You know, we're engaging with this public information. Yeah, okay, yes.
Do you have any thoughts about what scientists should do if one of their stories is sort of spun into one of these mis or disinformation pieces? Like, is there a responsibility to push back on that, or does that just draw more attention to it, that could hurt things further?
All of the above. And this is me speaking from experience, having my work, and I was like, I didn't say that. I was like, what? To a certain extent, there isn't a whole lot you can do. I mean, unless you are the editor and you can personally retract it. You know, I've known people that would go to the editors and say, you know, can you put out a retraction? And sometimes that happens. Sometimes it doesn't. And then you have to figure how much emotional labor you want to put into that if you want to fight that fight. Sometimes it's worth it, maybe sometimes it's not. But I mean, all you can do is say, absolutely, that's not what I said. But I've known other people who have written in other places and said, let me tell you about this source that twisted my work, and I'm going to tell you what I really meant. All right, so there are various ways, I think, to kind of go around that.
Could I just put out a shout out to our news bureau if you're here at the University of Illinois, because I have experienced this, and I called the news bureau and I said, advice, help, and the advice and the help I got was unbelievably valuable. It made all the difference in the world. Really, we have folks here at the university who know what they're doing, and they'll help you.
And on that note, thank you all.